Welcome everybody to a very special concluding event of this week's 10-year anniversary celebrations of IST Austria. We have a joint lecture between IST Austria and the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and it's my real pleasure to welcome here Professor Anton Zeilinger, the President of the Austrian Academy of Sciences.
Thank you very much. May I briefly introduce the Academy, since I'm sure not everybody knows about it. It's an Austrian story, like many Austrian stories, like the founding of this institution, kind of, unusual at the time and so on. The story goes back to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German mathematician, philosopher, and so on, in around 1710. He came here and he suggested to found an academy. Like he founded the Russian Academy, he founded the Preußische Akademie, and he founded the Saxonian Academy. And the answer here was the standard answer you get in Austria, which is? Yeah, niet, but why? No money. The answer was there was no money. This is the usual excuse. But the feeling is that it was really that people were afraid of free thinking. And institutions like the Academy or like this institution, and we heard it at the celebration 2 days ago, are really founded on the freedom of science, the freedom of thinking. So we were founded then in 1847, and today I want to invite you all to come to the next ISTA ÖAW lecture, which will happen in a year, I suppose. But not in our academy, right? We have to do it here again because we are remodeling. The academy today has about 120 full members from all fields, 250 corresponding members. This is a kind of a pre-status. And about 350 foreign members. And you only can become member by being elected by those who are members already. There's no. I once said to the Prime Minister of Belarus, I told him, in Austria, if a politician would simply just express that he wants a certain person as president, that person would certainly not be elected, knowing that in Belarus it's slightly different. Anyway. So much about. We also have a young academy where some people of IST Austria are members. There's 17 people who should be below 35, I think, and I would actually lower the age. Right? It should be below 30, but that's a different story. Now to the lectures. Very briefly, the lectures started in 2016. These joint lectures between IST and the academy. Because we are the largest non-university research institutions. We have a slightly different focus, except we have some overlap in the natural sciences, but we are very strong in humanities and so on. The first lecture was given in 2016 by David Gross, a Nobel laureate in physics from Santa Barbara, and the title, The Frontiers of Fundamental Physics. Then in 2017, we had the Nobel laureate Christiane Nüßlein-Volhard, a developmental biologist from Tübingen, same place, there seems to be a cluster, on the title, The Development of Color Patterns in Fishes Towards an Understanding of the Evolution of Beauty. And last year, exactly 1 year ago, we had the Fields medalist Martin Heyrer, Imperial College London, on bridging scales. And having said that, I would like to pass it back on to Tom.
Let me add here, just like Leibniz suggested the founding of the academy, it was actually Anton Zeilinger who suggested the founding of IST Austria. And they didn't say no, what I mean. Yeah, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce the speaker of today, Bernhard Schölkopf, one of the preeminent researchers in machine learning. His main contributions, support vector machines and kernel methods, but he also did many applications, biomedical applications in neuroscience, in digital photography, in astronomy even. His background is in mathematics and physics. He got his PhD at the Technical University of Berlin. He was appointed a director of the Max Planck Society in 2001, coming actually from Microsoft Research in Cambridge. And in 2011, he was actually the founding director of a new Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems in Tübingen. I can only mention a few of the many awards he has received: the Agawal Prize of the International Association of Pattern Recognition, the Max Planck Research Prize, the Leibniz Prize in Germany, the highest prize in Germany, the Academy Prize of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy, the Milner Award of the Royal Society. He's also an Amazon Distinguished Scholar. He is instrumental in efforts like the Open Access Journal on machine learning research, and also in efforts of the European Union in artificial intelligence. And he is one of the most highly cited computer scientists in the world, and perhaps the most highly cited in Europe. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a little bit intimidating, especially after having heard the previous speakers in this lecture series. So I'll try to do my best and tell you something about machine learning, something about causal structures underlying machine learning, and then at the end something about what we think Europe should do to keep up with the developments that we think will change the world that we live in. So I'm from the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems, and we're interested in intelligent behavior. The world is full of intelligent behavior. Up here we see a white blood cell that pursues a bacterium in the bloodstream. Here a frog trying to catch an insect. Here we have some humans doing parkour. And here we have a group of humans engaging in a complex form of collective behavior. And we're interested in the organizing principles underlying behavior, and we think that one of these principles has to do with learning. Now, learning is by now also a reasonably old field already, and I want to take you a little bit back into the history to the year 1958. This is a page from the New York Times reporting in this little article over here on a new machine which was called the perceptron. So Frank Rosenblatt depicted over here. He demonstrated his perceptron was a physical machine, and he demonstrated that the perceptron can learn from experience, learn from examples, and he predicted that later perceptrons will be able to recognize people, instantly translate spoken language. So this was quite adventurous at the time to predict these kind of things. But looking back, this was the birth of a field which came to be known as connectionism, so the attempt to build synthetic brains, if you want. Now, around the same time, there was another quite revolutionary development, maybe even more revolutionary development underway, which was that people understood that computers can do more than compute with numbers. Computers can actually process symbols. And this insight, in a way, gave birth to the field of computer science, the way we now know it. And this insight, which was initially also motivated by the quest for artificial intelligence, the success of this insight was so impressive that funding for connectionism actually completely stopped. So this paradigm won the race for funding, and people moved into this field, and they believed that the manipulation of symbols in programs written by humans would be enough to generate intelligence. One of the fathers of that field, Herb Simon here, who won both a Nobel Prize and a Turing Award, he predicted that machines would be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do. So that's how he put it. So these people then set out to automate the work or to do the work that the men around them were presumably doing, and these were things like theorem proving, so they worked on automatic theorem proving, things like chess, so they worked on computer chess, and initially the results were actually quite encouraging. But the strange thing was that the problems that actually appeared simple, such as most things that humans and animals can do, even if they're not intelligent, turned out to be quite hard for the computers. So strangely, the hard things were simple, and the simple things were hard, and this came to be known as Moravec's paradox. Now, so the big hopes that were initially raised by artificial intelligence were disappointed, and interest in artificial intelligence eventually declined. And so there were huge numbers of attendance at the conferences at some point. Eventually, this got much smaller. Until suddenly the field of machine learning started to boom again, coming back with a vengeance, and with attendance numbers really going through the roof. So last year at the NIPS, or now NeurIPS conference, the conference, which is the size of roughly 10,000 people, sold out within 15 minutes of the website opening. So in machine learning, so the classical AI, the rules were shaped by humans. In machine learning, the rules are shaped by learning. And the encouraging thing about machine learning was that we could finally tackle the problems that looked easy but had proven hard for old AI, such as these motor problems. So here we have a Japanese game which is called Kendama. Our PhD student, Katharina Mülling, first shows the arm how to do this. So you have to catch the ball. And then the robot first just repeats that movement, and then afterwards learns a policy by changing the movement such that the place where the ball falls down gets closer and closer to this cup. And eventually, after around 100 trials, the arm can do it, which is maybe roughly the same length that a human takes to learn this task. The only difference is that the robot after that can do it, and the human has to play again, trial and error. So this was encouraging, and there's a number of other applications that are encouraging now, and that can solve, for many of them are in the visual domain. So this is an application we worked on in the medical space, medical image processing. So here the problem was the following. We worked together with a physicist and in the clinic who developed joint PET-MR scanners, so by developing PET detectors that work in high magnetic fields, which you have when you do MR. Now the problem is traditionally PET was usually combined with computer tomography, which is very handy because computer tomography gives you a signal which you can use to do what's called the attenuation correction, to normalize the PET signal, because otherwise you cannot quantify, you cannot interpret these signals. Now, if we don't want to do CT anymore, which is desirable because the radiation damage is not significant if you do a computer tomography too often. So if you combine it with MR, you don't have this signal anymore to do the attenuation correction, but it turned out using machine learning, using pairs of MR and CT images for a set of patients, one could learn a mapping that, given an MR image, predicts a synthetic CT image, so it just predicts how the CT image would look, which means you have to predict how thick the bone would be, etc. And then using these CT images, doing the attenuation correction, you get actually a quantification error below 1%. Another set of examples here from also from the visual domain. Here we start with a low-resolution image. We've trained a system, in this case the neural network, to basically on millions of natural images to learn about the statistics of natural images, and then to generate the most likely image that, when downsampled, will give you this low-resolution image. So this is our input. Now we can synthetically generate an image like that, which sort of at first glance looks impressive. Maybe the beak is not so impressive because we know beaks don't look like this. Also the iris opening is a little bit strangely shaped, etc. And when you compare it to the ground truth, you can see that ground truth is indeed different. Another example that maybe shows the weaknesses a little bit more pronounced is this image here, which we all recognize to be a British telephone cell. So a telephone booth. So if we fantasize a high resolution image that can give rise to this one, we get something like this, which by and large looks good, but it just jumbles up the text completely and it doesn't know what's written there. And of course, the ground truth looks different. So these are just a few examples to give you an idea of what this is about, and let's try to generalize a bit and think about what are the aspects of these problems that can be solved with what people now call big data. So here, a typical big data example where you have a learning curve that shows some measure of accuracy. In this case, it's a task from bioinformatics as a function of the number of training examples. And the interesting thing about these applications exemplified with this one is that if you only look at a few training examples, let's say 1,000, you are effectively just guessing. So you wouldn't see any structure, and probably in this case, this is a DNA sequence classification task. Humans wouldn't look at 1,000 training examples. So for us, this would probably look random, but if we move up to 10 million, we get quite a respectable performance here. So from that point of view, already at that time, I think in a number of applications, we had reached a point where on certain pattern recognition problems, machines outperform humans. So machines can find things that humans can't find when it comes to pattern recognition. So these problems are usually high-dimensional and complex, for instance, non-linear, non-stationary, etc. They are usually a problem where we have relatively little mechanistic understanding. If we have an explicit model of what's going on, then of course we should be using that model. But if we don't have that, if we want to do something in a complex world that doesn't lend itself to this kind of modeling, then that's where the big data or machine learning approaches excel. Now, as a consequence of these complications here, we usually need large training sets. But if we do have these large training sets, there are theoretical results that tell us that in the limit, as the training set goes to infinity, we can do as well as possible. So we can, nobody can beat us, not a human can beat us, no animal can beat us. But there's some fine print in these results, and the main fine print is that the data has to be IID, which means independent and identically distributed. So that means the data that we get during training, when we train our system, it means in particular that data comes exactly from the same distribution, from the same regularity as the test data. So nothing is allowed to change between training and test. And we usually don't talk about that, but that's really the biggest weakness of these methods. And I'll get back to that. I'll talk a lot about this later on in the talk. But first, just to give you a very, very rough flavor, what is the problem at all? What is learning theory about? Just in 2 slides. And the central issue of learning theory is what's called generalization. So, and we can think about this this issue or this problem with these simple number sequences. So suppose someone gives you this sequence of numbers and asks you what's the next number in this row. So maybe someone wants to guess. 11, 12, yes. Anything else? Okay, let's see. So they're both good answers. So for instance, you could say this is the law that generates this sequence. So we just add 4 to get the next one. This is a nice sequence. It even has a name. It's called the lazy caterer sequence because it gives you the maximum number of pieces that you can cut a cake into with n cuts. So you just have to make sure that each cut intersects all previous cuts. So that's why this thing increases this. Of course, the pieces won't have equal size, but the mathematicians don't care about that. 12, someone said 12. There's also a simple law for 12. There's also a nice law for 13. It's the so-called Fibonacci sequence. And there's a website. You go to this website, you enter these numbers, you get 600 hits. So 600 meaningful ways to continue this sequence, and maybe by now more, because I checked this some years ago. So obviously, this is difficult to decide what's the next number. So in a certain sense, it doesn't make sense to ask which continuation is correct. So which law generalizes, it's probably not decidable. And the philosophers have known this for a long time. They call this the induction problem. Now, the problem that statistical learning theory is starting is a slightly different one. It doesn't want to make a statement about whether that single solution works or not, but it wants to give some methodological recommendations. how we should perform inference. So it's asking what method should we use to find regularities that are probably approximately correct. And one could argue that this is closer to what philosophers, in particular Popper, so Popper referred to this as Kant's demarcation problem. So the problem, what separates metaphysics from physics? How do you recognize that you're a physicist? He would say you recognize it by the fact that you are following certain methodological procedures in how you obtain knowledge. So I won't go into details on that, but let's leave it at that. So there are mathematical statements about generalization. They usually don't tell you anything for sure. They give you probabilities. They basically tell you if you start with a class of models, which is simple in the sense that it's unlikely that it can generate random data. So it can only generate, in a sense, a tiny fraction of all possible data sets that you might encounter in a random world. If you start with such a model and now you end up actually explaining the training data that you're given, then you have reason to believe this thing will generalize, because that basically tells you actually my training data is not random and I have used the right kind of model for that data. So this can be formalized, but let's not go into that now. Now, an impressive success of the learning approach that probably most of you have seen was the DeepMind Atari system. And this was a deep neural network that learned to play a number of computer games. And this was at the time interpreted as a form of general artificial intelligence. But of course, it should be taken with a grain of salt. So this system, I mean, it was, I don't know, 20 different games or something like that. Of course, it has to be retrained on every game, and it has to be retrained on a huge training set from that game. And the training set size is basically unlimited because they have an emulation running on their computer. And also they used some clever tricks to effectively make the training data IID. So basically they're storing training data, permuting it, retraining every so often, etc. So in a way, one could say this is an AI problem which was turned into a large-scale pattern recognition problem. And pattern recognition, that's what we're good at in machine learning. That's what we can solve. So if you're interested in that, at the time I wrote this in a commentary that appeared alongside the paper in the same journal. Now, another area where progress has been quite dramatic is object recognition. So we can train systems on huge sets of labeled images, and then by some measure of success, so here the top output is always a cow, and we see these are cows, so by some measure of success, one could argue that we are now achieving or maybe even surpassing human-level performance on some of these problems. But if there are things in a test image, so in this case a beach or the sea, that turn out to be negatively correlated with whether there's a cow present in the training set, then it turns out the system may not recognize the cows anymore. So in this case, a cow doesn't appear anywhere, or just further down the list. And one could say that the reason for this is that machine learning only looks for correlations in the training set, and it doesn't care about causality. And if then something changes in the distribution and the correlation structure is different, even though the cows are still there, they are not recognized anymore. And the same problem appears in an even more extreme form in this problem of adversarial vulnerability. So these systems, they are so highly optimized to a given data set, so in one IID setting, that they are not robust at all with respect to small violations of the IID assumption. So in this case, the small violation just constitutes or is made up by adding a tiny little bit of noise to the original image, which is nicely recognized as a pig. So that leads to an image which to us still looks like a pig. We don't see the difference, but certainly the neural network recognizes it as an airliner. And that's really quite disturbing. Now, if we think about how all these problems are solved, I mean, why are we so good on these data sets? These are huge data sets, and they are hand-labeled by humans. So what we usually don't see in machine learning, we usually don't talk about, there's a huge industry of people labeling these images. And in the old days, I remember Antonio Torralba, as a big computer vision researcher at MIT, he was from Spain, he said his labeler was his mother, and she spent months sitting at home at her computer labeling data for him. But that's not enough anymore nowadays. So there's a whole industry of people labeling data. recently I read even that this is now becoming prison work to label data. So that's how so basically our approach as a community to solve this problem that we're not robust with respect to violations of the IID setting is just we are labeling more data and hoping that eventually we will just cover everything that's possible. But I think it's gradually becoming clear that this is not going to solve the problem. And I think we also see it in applications. For instance, we see it in the fact that we've been told already years ago that Tesla will robustly drive autonomously. I think Elon Musk was saying, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago that next year we will have it. And I think the latest announcement was that next year they will autonomously navigate a parking lot. So it seems we have a problem, and in the next part of the talk, I'll try to explain to you that I think this problem has something to do with causality. I already alluded to it a bit before. Yeah? So it's about this IID assumption, which is not so innocuous as it seems, and it's also not so innocuous when it comes to interventions in a system. And this is an example of an intervention. In this case, it's a recommendation. So here someone is trying to buy a laptop rucksack, and then the system, and I should say, this doesn't work anymore. So of course, these systems are improved, but this is from some years ago. So the person looks for this rucksack, and then the system recommends, why don't you also buy a laptop to go along with your rucksack? And this is funny for us, because we probably think the reason why this person wants the rucksack is that they already have a laptop. So there's some directionality there. The laptop is the cause for wanting the rucksack and not vice versa. Now, machine learning doesn't care about cause and effect, it just cares about correlations or statistical dependencies. And it is exploiting something which is called mutual information, and the mutual information is a symmetric concept. Mutual information between A and B is the same as between B and A, even though somehow physically the intuition is quite different. We would say that a cause contains information about an effect because it controls the effect, whereas the effect contains information about the cause because it somehow, maybe it carries a footprint of the cause. And it turns out if we measure these informations using mutual information, we get the same number. Now, once we intervene in a system, this difference becomes important. And this is not captured by standard machine learning. And also an intervention in a system actually turns out it leads us to a different distribution. It's no longer the observational distribution when we passively observe data, but we actually change something. And then, in a way, you could also say standard models are not robust with respect to this change. And the first person, or possibly the first person who understood these subtle connections between statistics and causality was the philosopher and later also physicist Hans Reichenbach. A very interesting character who, I think he wrote his PhD thesis on foundations of probability. He didn't find a PhD advisor first who would give him a degree for it. Eventually he managed to do it. And then he was hired by Planck and von Laue and Einstein to the physics department in Berlin. 1938 he had to leave and went to Istanbul and then later to Los Angeles. So he said that he wrote a book which is called The Direction of Time, and in this book he says that if we find two variables, x and y, to be correlated or more generally statistically dependent, then there must be a causal explanation for that. And in the generic case, this causal explanation is that there's another variable that causes both of them. And he also said this variable can be chosen such that it explains all the correlation, which means that conditioned on this, those two become independent. Now, this case here includes as special cases these two cases. So Z could coincide with X or Y. So if we think of sort of a nice standard example in causality, if we find that in European countries, which is the case, the frequency of storks and the human birth rate are correlated, then this could be due to the storks bringing the babies. It could be that the babies are attracting the storks, or it could be that there's something else that we haven't measured that causes both of them or influences both of them. And this could be something like economic development. Now, the interesting thing is if you are only given observations from X and Y, you cannot distinguish between these three cases. Any possible joint distribution of X and Y basically could be explained by any of these three models. And I thought maybe I'll give you another example for the subtleties in the connection between correlation and causality, which is Bergson's paradox, which I think is also so interesting that anybody should see it sometime. So in this case, let's assume x, y, and z are binary variables. And to make it simple, I give you an example to give you some mental image about it. So let's start with two assumptions. So let's assume that, let's consider the population of politicians. It's easy to bash politicians, so I apologize if there are politicians in the room. It's just the pedagogical examples. So let's assume that for politicians, and it's probably not true, but for the sake of argument, let's assume there's no correlation between whether you have a high IQ or whether you're corrupt. And the second assumption, let's assume that a politician is successful if either they have a high IQ, so that's certainly useful in many jobs in life, but maybe corruption also helps you with some things. So let's say they're successful if at least one of them must be the case, possibly both. Then the paradox is, even though these things were uncorrelated to begin with, among the politicians that are successful, there would be a negative correlation between intelligence and corruption. So you could say, actually, that's a nice conclusion, because among the politicians that are successful, you just have to look for whether they're intelligent, and that already reduces the probability that they're corrupt. So go for intelligent politicians, that's always a good thing. And just for people to get the intuition, so if these are all the possible cases, then let's think about all the combinations. So if someone has a high IQ and is corrupt, so that's a positive correlation. Low IQ, not corrupt, positive correlation. The other two cases are negative. But if we now filter out these cases, because we're only saying the successful ones have to be high IQ or corrupt or both, so we're kicking out this thing. We're left with this distribution here, and then overall we have a negative correlation that's left. So back to the Reichenbach model. So in the Reichenbach model, this can be generalized, and it has been generalized by people like Pearl, but also by, this goes back a long time to people working on structural equation modeling and econometrics, etc., path diagrams in biology, genetics, etc. But it is a beautiful theory now put into the present form by Judea Pearl. And I won't go into details on this. The only thing that I want to say is, so you generalize basically the Reichenbach principle, then you get a model which shows you that a certain causal structure, and causal structure means a variable that's caused by others is a function of the others and some independent noise term. So given a causal structure encoded in such a graph, it turns out this implies a probability distribution over the observables, which has certain interesting conditional independence properties, and these are testable from data. So causal structures do have testable implications. That seems like a contradiction to what I said before, but it turns out, since these are implications stated in terms of conditional independence always needs three quantities. So if you only have two variables, nothing follows, so there's nothing testable. So people felt that the two-variable case is actually not solvable. But it turns out one can do something, and we've been working on this problem for the last 10 years or so. So the two-variable problem, which is also an old problem of philosophy. So according to Nietzsche, it's so the error of mistaking cause for consequence. He says it's reason's intrinsic form of corruption. So let's think whether we can sometimes solve the two-variable problem, and let's start with an example. So this is a data set from the German Weather Service. And what you see in the data set, these are different weather stations. You see the altitude in meters and the average annual temperature Celsius. And you can see we don't have mountains that are as high as in Austria. There's only one up here. Most of the places are lower. And you see that as you go higher, it gets colder. And you can now ask yourself, does altitude cause temperature, or does temperature cause altitude, or maybe there's a confounder that causes both of them? How would we go about solve this problem? So we could do an intervention. That's the gold standard in the end. So we could build a big apparatus that raises the weather station by a few hundred meters, and then we measure the temperature over here and see if it changes. And maybe, hopefully, we would find that it changes. And then the opposite intervention in the other direction is we build a big heating system around the weather station, and we measure if the altitude changes. And I think you will all believe that the altitude won't change. So you have some idea what will change and what will not change. So in a way, maybe even a hypothetical intervention will be enough to convince you. And the reason, if you think about why that will convince you, I would argue it's probably because you can think of a physical mechanism that we can write as this conditional distribution, P of T. So basically it's a mechanism that, given a distribution of altitudes or given some altitudes, tells you what are the likely temperatures. So this mechanism we would probably think is independent of what kind of altitudes we plug in. And it turns out if we assume that, so these two things are independent, then in certain formalization we can prove that in the opposite direction this independence is violated. But I won't go into detail on that. A second way to look at it would be to say we would probably also believe that this mechanism is invariant, for instance, across different countries in a similar climate zone. So if we, for instance, if we looked at this curve, it would probably look different between Austria and Switzerland, but we probably would think that this mechanism might still be quite similar. So maybe the altitude distribution is different. Maybe the Swiss built their cities in different places, but the physics should be relatively similar. And I'll show you a second example, which I quite like. This is from human perception. So in this case, we have this thing which is called a Béchet chair. And so when we see this chair, well, you see it's not really a chair. Whenever you see anything, your brain makes the assumption that the object out there in the world and the mechanism by which the information from the object enters your brain are independent. So that's also some sort of generic viewpoint assumption. If you violate this assumption, for instance, by looking through this hole, then actually you see something which in reality is not there. You see an object which is not there. So that means your perception has failed. So perception in the generic case assumes that there is this independence, and we could state it like this: the causal generative process is composed of autonomous modules that do not inform or influence each other. And it also has this aspect of invariance, because if you look at an object, sometimes you can take an object and you can close one eye so you don't have stereo vision, you move your head around, you get an idea of the 3D structure of the object. Why can you do that? This only works because you assume that the object doesn't change as you turn your head around. If the object were allowed to change, especially if it were allowed to change in a way that's coupled to your perceptual process, anything can go wrong. So this is a good assumption. We make it all the time. Turns out, I won't go into details on that, it turns out one can formalize this assumption and one can use it for cause-effect inference. So we will do cause-effect inference by saying the correct causal direction is the one where the mechanism is independent from the input distribution. And we can try this out on a number of data sets. We've collected various data sets. These are like, okay, I told you about the altitude and temperature, but for instance, the data set age and wage. So as people get older, the salary tends to go up. But if you give someone a salary raise, they don't get older from that or younger. So you cannot causally influence the age with the salary range, salary change. Anyway, so if we do this, basically, I don't want to discuss it in great detail, and we have a set of methods, but you can solve this problem better than chance. So you can distinguish cause and effect better than chance, it turns out, if you are willing to make the right kind of assumptions. And we did the same, we can apply the same to the problem of time series. So if sometimes someone gives you a time series and doesn't tell you whether it's forward or backwards, then that's also a classification problem. So you have to understand in the statistics of how they look across the time, whether it's a forward or a backward time series. And here I'm showing you, this is just an illustrative example. This is an old video from the Lumiere brothers. which I think is quite nice at that time. So they had a projector, they were showing it forward, and at some point the operator of the projector would start turning the crank backwards. And then you would suddenly, now it's starting backwards, you would see the whole thing in backwards. So one can apply these kind of methods also on videos, which we did, and you can tell what's forward and backwards. So you can find these asymmetries in the time evolution. Now I wanted to also, since we have eminent physicists in the audience, I put in a few physics slides that I think are connected in an interesting way to this independence principle. And this is related to the following thought experiment. So let's assume we have some particles, for instance some light, which is scattered at a non-trivial object here. So we think of this incoming beam as the cause, then we have a scattering process at this object, which is our mechanism, and then the outgoing beam, going in various directions, is the effect. And the outgoing beam, of course, contains information about the object. That's why photography is possible, right? Otherwise, you couldn't take pictures. It's also what makes vision possible. Now, of course, we know that microscopically, the time evolution is reversible. So it seems to be microscopically things are symmetric, but nevertheless, the photons contain information about the object only after the scattering, but not before. So that's strange. So why is that the case, or why do photographs show the past rather than the future? One way to answer this would be to say that there's an independence principle at work here, and we can formulate it. And I can't go into details on that. Turns out one can formulate these things in terms of what's called algorithmic complexity or Kolmogorov complexity. It's a form of description length. So if S is the initial state of our system and M is the dynamics, so let's say the scattering process, think of it as a map or a function, then we will assume that in the forward direction, in the causal direction, the initial state and the mechanism are algorithmically independent in the sense that if we, knowing one of them does not enable a shorter description of the other one and vice versa. So you cannot, by having both of them, you cannot jointly compress them to fewer bits than doing it independently. So suppose this is true, this independence. So this captures our intuition that the arrangement of these incoming beams knows nothing about the shape of the object and vice versa. Then it turns out, then we can prove that for these kinds of mappings that satisfy this condition, the Kolmogorov complexity is a monotonically increasing function. So the complexity of the state monotonically increases in this direction. And of course, if you're in the opposite direction, so that's one form of the second law of thermodynamics, if you are willing to accept Kolmogorov complexity as a measure of physical entropy, which I'm not going to answer. So of course, in the opposite direction, you could suppose you shoot in these photons, they're coming out these directions. Now you freeze the system, you stop each photon, you turn around the photons, then you let them shoot against this thing, and then they come out in this highly ordered state. That would seem like the entropy then decreases in that direction. But of course, in the opposite direction, you have an initial state which is very much dependent on this object, because it's the initial state that you obtain by taking the end state of this evolution and then turning it around. So that's why the independence principle is necessary here. Okay, so second short application of causality, this time in the field of exoplanet detection. So I'm quite fond of astronomy, and we had this very nice data set from the Kepler Space Telescope that has been staring at the same patch of Milky Way for 4 or 5 years. And the telescope is looking for what's called an exoplanet transit. So a transit means there's a planet that passes through the line of sight between a star and us. And if you think about it geometrically, it seems unlikely. It's quite unlikely, but not totally unlikely. If you think about the size of the sun and the Earth, if you fly out into space into a random direction, I think you have about a 0.5% chance that you can see an Earth transit if you wait for a year. So if you go in the right directions, you can see that. So Kepler is looking at several 100,000 stars, so there should be quite a few transits there, and people have found quite a few exoplanets in the Kepler data. So we're looking for these kind of events, but they're quite small. So in the case of Earth and Sun, it would be magnitude 10 to the minus 4, because the diameter of the Earth is about 1% of the diameter of the Sun, and this is quadratic because it's about the area. So it's a small event, and that's why we have to measure it from space, where there's less atmospheric disturbance, less noise, but still the instrument adds a lot of noise. And it turns out, if we look at what the instrument measures, so these are light curves for the pixels in the instrument. Each light curve is over 3 months. You can see some overall trends that are quite significant and that are probably not there in the original data. They're probably from the instrument, and you can corroborate this by looking at other stars, because the instrument measures more than one star. So let's look at some other stars. You can see, some of these curves look suspiciously similar. Now, why do they look similar? They shouldn't look similar, because these stars are light years apart from each other. There's no causal connection between them. They don't share information. The only way they can look similar is if this similarity comes from the instrument. So we have this situation. Our observation is confounded, or is a combination of both the astrophysical signal and the instrument. That's bad, because we really want this and we don't know this. But the good news is the instrument also affects the other stars. So it turns out if you make the right kind of assumptions, build the right kind of model, then you can remove the effect of the instrument by simply trying to predict your star of interest in terms of suitable other stars. So you're solving a suitable machine learning problem that actually you shouldn't be able to solve, because the stars have nothing to do with each other. But if you can solve it anyway and then subtract it from your measurement, it turns out you get a much better solution. And we've called this the milkman problem, because just for this analogy here, so this is again not to be taken seriously. So you see this picture of 5, let's assume these are siblings, and as you may have heard, there are some statistics that say that up to 20% of the children have a father different from the father they think is their father. And in England, and I lived in England when I worked on that, in this case the prime suspect is the milkman. And so now the milkman problem is not to reconstruct which child is the milkman's. That would be easy in this case. But the problem is we want to reconstruct the face of the milkman from the faces of many siblings without knowing the mother. And the algorithm will be that for each child, we try to explain the appearance of the child in terms of the other ones, and then the residual that's left over, that's our estimate for the milkman. And so if we do this thing, then we can process these raw light curves, and we get these nice curves that show the transit events that are relatively low noise and have less in terms of systematic errors than the standard methods that the astronomers were applying. And so there's other applications, and I might just go briefly through them. So applications of causality. So this is an application where we have data that is perturbed. So I told you before, perturbations can be very bad for machine learning systems. So we're trying to build something more robust. In this case, we try to build a system which is robust with respect to shifts of images, with respect to adding noise, and even with respect to inverting an image. And the way we do this here is that we have some kind of competition of different experts, and these experts during training, they specialize on different kinds of image degradations. And then afterwards, once a new image comes as an input, the system automatically decides which mechanism to apply to remove the degradation, and then we end up with images that look like this. Another cool thing is that this also generalizes to other distributions of data. So this is not fixed to that IID setting, but same kind of mechanisms do something meaningful on these so-called omniglot characters. And just very briefly, as a second recent piece of work, which is trying to combine deep learning and causality, is about interventional representations, trying to find representations and then whether the factors, the different factors that make up the image are somehow separated such that you can intervene upon them separately And then you can do things like, so this is an original image that you feed into the system, and then you do a suitable manipulation in the hidden layer of the neural network, and you generate a synthetic image. So this is completely synthetic, which in this case has a different background, but the animal is sort of more or less the same. Or you can also compute hybrids between images. So in this case, you have a koala and you have a teddy bear, and this is some strange thing in between, which is synthetic. Okay, so I think I have about 10 minutes left, so I want to end with a few general thoughts, where we're heading and what this means, maybe what this means also for us and what this means for Europe. Let me skip this one. So people talk about a revolution, or that we're experiencing some form of revolution, and maybe that's true. It's usually hard to tell while you're in the middle of it. So it's maybe sensible to compare to previous revolutions that humankind has experienced. And of course, we all know about the Industrial Revolution, triggered by the steam engine, water power, etc. And the Second Industrial Revolution, then driven by electrification. So if you think about what they have in common, you could say it's all about energy. So it's about generating, converting, processing energy. And since we have physicists in the audience, it's not really about generating, because we cannot generate energy. It's a conserved quantity, so it's about converting different energy forms into each other. And this way, then eventually replacing human labor by machine labor. Because, of course, previously, energy had been processed by humans. So we eat food, so we get chemical energy, we process it, and we turn it into mechanical energy. It's just a process that doesn't scale very well. And then with all these things, with all these steam engines, it turned out you could generate much more and industrialize it. Now, so currently, and of course we know that this had major implications for the lives of people. A lot of jobs were lost, and so the whole society has changed. Political changes were caused by it, etc. So I think that's important to think about when we think about our current revolution. Now, what is different about our current revolution? I would argue that it's very similar, only that energy is replaced by information. So information is also something that humans can process, and you may have heard that the first computers were actually humans, mostly women, doing calculations. So, I mean, humans are pretty good information processing systems, but maybe we're not very fast, and maybe it doesn't scale very well. So it turned out computers can do certain things faster, initially just for very structured data, but now increasingly using machine learning also for unstructured data. So if you want, machine learning is a way, just like the different devices that were developed to process energy, is a way to go through a large data set, sort of pick up little pieces of information that are in this data set and then transform it into something that's useful for you. And so also about generating, converting, processing. And also here, the word generating, you have to be careful, because I think there's quite a few physicists who would argue that information is also a conserved quantity. But probably it's fair to say that we don't yet have an equally good understanding of information as we have for energy now. And probably energy also wasn't fully understood. Probably it only was really understood towards the end of these industrial revolutions. So that's where we are. So this is possibly an equally big change as the first industrial revolutions were. Maybe even bigger, because information in some sense is more human than energy. I think we are more proud of our information processing capabilities than we are of our energy processing capabilities. There are animals that are stronger than us, but we think we're the smartest animal. And so energy processing is really the basis of our dominance on this planet. And information, so if you can do large-scale information processing, you can also manipulate on a large scale. And manipulation has been there all the time. This is a famous example from the Soviet days. But this took a lot of manual labor to generate, to remove these images of people that were no longer popular, until at the end only Stalin is left. Nowadays, we can do things like this on a much larger scale. and everybody has a smartphone. We can put software on them. We can train them in certain things. So there's this app in China that I would really like to see sometime. I've read a lot about it, which is called Study the Great Nation, where you get trained in whatever the Chinese leadership thinks you should know. And with these changes that we now see, the AI-driven information processing touches a lot of notions that are quite human and quite close to what we think makes up humankind. It also touches things like transparency, privacy, fairness, and health. And this is an example from fairness and health. So in this case, there was a system that was trained on a certain population. There was a paper from Heidelberg, so I assume it was a population, that people coming into that hospital. And it turned out that this system was detecting skin cancer very well for those patients, but not so well for black patients, which then, of course, is unfair and rightly criticized. Now, of course, if you think about it, the same may also be true for a doctor working in Heidelberg who sees mostly white patients. So sometimes thinking about fairness of machines also questions our own fairness notions. But at the same time, the potential, of course, of these methods in medicine is huge, because in the end, medicine is based on experience. And if you can combine the experience of millions of medical cases, then you can, and I think we will see this in more and more diagnostic domains, you can achieve superhuman performance. And I think in 20 years, most diagnoses will be supported by things like that. Okay, so let's go back to this slide from before. So I told you about this development. Machine learning is increasing strongly. The old fields or the old methods are gradually being replaced by machine learning in some domains. I know machine learning is not the full story. I mean, I've been criticizing pattern recognition for half of my talk also, but most of the action right now is in data-driven methods, and I think this won't go away, because I have the feeling the examples of intelligence that we see in humans and animals, they are not programmed into the brains, but they are mostly learned either by evolution or by learning during ontogenesis. So I think data-driven methods won't go away. Now, unfortunately for Europe, there's quite a significant dominance of American institutions in data-driven AI. So in America, almost all of AI is machine learning. And if you go to the top conferences, so this is very small. This is a recent analysis, ICML 2019, which is taking place next week in America. All the top institutions are American. Number one is Google, quite a few universities also. Very few European institutions. Happy to say that ISTA appears somewhere in this list. But overall, unfortunately, quite few. Now in Germany, Tübingen is the top place, and this was maybe a lucky development for us, that we started machine learning there. Actually, at a time when the computer science department was not very strong. We started in the Max Planck Institute, and then gradually the computer science department followed this development, and now we have quite a respectable group of people together doing machine learning. And this has led to some local activity, which is called Cyber Valley. We started in doctoral schools. There's a lot of new professors at the university. We're becoming quite attractive. So we've recently managed to attract Peter Dayan, who's a famous reinforcement learning specialist. He was the postdoc advisor of two of the founders of DeepMind. So I think it is possible in Europe to also recruit competitively, and I think ISTA is also such an example where people had the courage to build something and try a new model. So we're currently doing something like this in Tübingen around our institute. So we built the regional AI ecosystem. We also try to help the German national strategy. So we have an AI center which is funded in the national strategy. We've started to reach out to other places. We currently have joint PhD programs with Cambridge and Zurich. But from this experience, it became clear that this can only be the beginning. If we really want to be competitive as Europe, we have to work together, all the top institutions in Europe. And that's what we started doing together with some of the people in the audience here, like Seppo Reiter, Bernhard Nessler, and I think there must be others. I'm very bad at face recognition, so bear with me if I forget you. So we started working together. We founded something we called ELIS, European Laboratory for Learning and Intelligent Systems. The idea is very much inspired by the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, which was founded, I don't know, like half a century ago, and which is now a top place in molecular biology. So outstanding scientific quality labs in the partner countries, fellows and students across Europe, visitor programs, etc. Ideally, a joint PhD program, tenure track, so people should be able to stay in the European system, get to know different places, etc. Important component is that startups should be very easy to do. People should be empowered rather than hindered. And overall, we think this could create a European identity like EMBL. And we think this is important because, as I explained before, these methods, they will change our lives. Nobody can seriously predict the way they will change our lives, but I think it's relatively safe to predict that the kind of AI that will be developed in Europe will have a slightly different character from how it's interpreted in China and how it's done in America. So I think it's important that the highest level of AI is also done here in Europe. And so we've started doing this. We founded some research program. Each of these programs, they're all led by top people. They include 10 to 15 fellows that meet probably 2 times a year. We're just starting, so we've just reviewed them. So overall, we have a grand plan. We're hoping that we can realize this, so we're hoping for support. We're going to have some discussions in Austria also, and a number of countries are interested in being involved in this. So we're quite optimistic now about this. And in the end, we want to create the place to be in AI overall as a network in Europe of top institutions, so that the young students want to come here and do their stuff here, because in the end, the future stuff that we're now speculating that will happen in AI will be created by these young people. And that's why I would like to end with this nice quotation of Jeff Hinton. The future depends on some graduate student who is deeply suspicious of everything I have said. Thank you very much.